Welcome to the IndyStar Sports Day podcast. I am Matt Glenesk. We are joined today by IndyStar's IU insider Zach Osterman, who Zach had a busy day on Tuesday in Bloomington as Archie Miller and his three new assistants spoke to beat reporters for the first time, really in a little more relaxed setting than a normal news conference. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think it was designed to be that way. I think it was designed to be a little bit more sort of informal and personal, and I don't know if you'd necessarily call it getting to know you, something quite that simple, but that was kind of the idea, that we were all asked to introduce ourselves by name and affiliation, whatever news organization we worked for.
Do you have name tags? Did they give you name tags?
No. Tom Osterman told me he read my stuff a lot. I apologized for that.
Don't you do that.
Other than that.
We ask people to pay for your content. Don't apologize for them paying to read it. Okay?
Well,
your livelihood, your future employment depends on it, okay? Don't undersell.
Fair point.
Yeah, don't undersell.
Never
Especially to your
apologize.
boss who's doing your review. So don't undersell. Okay? Keep that in mind. All
Always
right.
be closing.
So, ABC. All right, so hit us with some of your, I guess. Let's start with Archie. Some of your impressions on Archie. He talked about, I'm sure he talked about style of play. He talked about his recruiting philosophy. He talked about the guys already on this roster, and he said that in his introductory news conference that first and foremost he was going to focus on the guys on this roster already. So he's had some time to work with them. We've all seen some of the social media videos of them working out. What are our first impressions of Archie Miller, and what are his first impressions of the roster he has?
Well, my first impressions and what I wrote today is essentially he gives off the feeling that he's gotten very comfortable very quickly with his new surroundings. And I think that one of the questions about Archie Miller coming from Dayton was essentially how I don't think anybody thought he wouldn't adjust to a bigger stage. And look, that there's going to be much more high pressure moments, obviously. But there was a question of just, how quickly does he just kind of make that just sort of adjustment to going from Dayton, which is a place where there's actually a pretty decent, pretty strong fan base, a lot of interest, to a place like Indiana where obviously things are very, very, very intense at times. And he doesn't really seem kind of fazed by it. Not that you would expect a coach to walk into a press conference like today and just be like, boy, I don't know, I might be in over my head here. But he seems to have a strong command of his roster already. He could talk very specifically about some of what he likes in a lot of individual players. He could talk pretty specifically about what he likes in that 2017 class he's got. He was willing to kind of go into detail on just about anything, even kind of Colin Hartman's injury and sort of current status in terms of where he is and coming back and all that kind of stuff.
That's a breath of fresh air.
It just sort of felt like what's up?
I said that's a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, no, well, it just feels like a guy who, like I said, has figured out how to get both hands on the wheel very quickly. And that's something that it sounds, you would imagine, I guess, that any coach would eventually, to use that metaphor again, get both hands on the wheel. But it's a question of how quickly you can do that is going to answer questions of how quickly you can move on to other things like recruiting, like roster development, like planning, scheduling, and really starting to think in a serious, drilled down way about what you need for the upcoming season and so on and so forth, and executing a sort of a larger vision. And it just feels like he's already got a lot of those things settled. He seems very comfortable with his current staff. I think that it came together. I don't want to say it came together fast, but I don't think it came together slowly either. And I think you've heard nationally a lot of people praise every one of those three hires. We heard from all three of those guys today too. And so it just sort of feels like Archie Miller has very quickly gotten Indiana marching to the step he wants, and really kind of, found his strike zone in his new job. And I think that's important for the program because it allows you to sort of turn the page to whatever Miller wants to emphasize in recruiting and development and preparation for next season as soon as possible.
You talk about recruiting, and obviously it was important for him to retain all three of Tom Crean's signees, and he kind of elaborated on why that was so important. Maybe not so much, that they are just good players that he wants on his team, but in terms of roster building and what it means for 2 years down the line to have this team, to have these recruits coming in this year and not having to start from scratch this year.
Yeah, I mean, and it was interesting kind of to hear a coach talk about that, because you know what he's saying, but you don't hear coaches talk about it a lot. Essentially, let's say Indiana under an optimal scenario gets James Blackman, Robert Johnson back next year. Then you're in a situation where you've got those two plus Josh Newkirk, Tim Priller, and Colin Hartman. That's 5 seniors, which obviously is very good. If you're Archie Miller, if you're a new head coach, you like the idea of having 3, 4, 5 really, really experienced players at the top of your roster, guys with great leadership qualities and things like that, and lots of experience. But the issue he sort of pointed out is if you wind up in a situation, this can happen in coaching changes sometimes, where the turnover causes the recruiting class to thin out and you don't wind up with as many freshmen as you feel like you wanted, then what's going to happen is you're going to lose all those seniors next year, and you're essentially going to have to recruit 2 classes in one, because you would have lost the 2017 class, basically. Plus, you've got to have a pretty big 2018 class to fill all these spots that are potentially, again, assuming Indiana gets most or all of its seniors back for next year. We still don't know about some NBA decisions and things like that. But assuming they do, then you've also got to recruit a pretty big 2018 class just to replace those guys. And all of a sudden you're talking about a 7, maybe even an 8-man freshman class, or maybe you go for 6 or 7 freshmen and a grad transfer or 2, but you're just talking about a ton of roster turnover. Whereas you bring in those 3 guys, as Indiana's going to do, then next year you got to go get 4 or 5 to replace the seniors, but you've just got a more natural sort of progression of having a nice little balance between each class. Because, I thought something else he said that was interesting. He wasn't really talking about talent, but he was talking more about experience and work ethic and things like that. He said you always want to have older guys that know what it takes, that know what working hard looks like at this level, and how to work hard but work well, and all those different kinds of things, how to set an example. You always want to put those older guys in front of younger guys. And if you basically miss a class, and I think this has happened to Indiana in the last a couple times, in the last once or twice in the last 5 years, say, if you basically miss a class because of attrition or transfers or a bunch more guys leaving early for the NBA than you thought you would, you're not going to have that, and so you're going to wind up with a roster that is very, very heavy on youth, and it's going to put a lot of strain on what experienced players you do have to be even more sort of comprehensive leaders. And so I think when he was talking about retaining those 3 guys, Al Durham, Justin Smith, Clifton Moore, he wasn't just talking about their talent. He was also talking about being able to always have a solid, balanced roster and being able to kind of keep the rhythm, if you will, of guys outgoing and guys incoming, just sort of steady and solid year over year.
Do we have any more clarity regarding the NBA draft decisions of these? We know OG Anunoby is gone. Thomas Bryant, James Blackman Jr., Robert Johnson have all declared for the draft, but not hired an agent, so they have until May 24th to decide if they want to come back or not. Last week you had a story where you talked with a number of NBA scouts just on what they feel about these 3 players. It seemed that if the NBA scouts were telling all 3 of these guys, if they were advising them, they'd say go back to school. If that's the case, then IU is oversigned, and then you have an issue of too many guys on the roster, too many scholarship players. So that would have to be something to shake out. But is there any clarity? I mean, this is people you talked with said Thomas Bryant is, he will get drafted if he goes, but it would likely be in the second round. And it didn't seem like James Blackman Jr. or Robert Johnson had much traction. Obviously, this is before the combine, before any workouts they can have with teams, so there's still a long ways to go. But is there any more clarity on the NBA situations with these players?
I think the combine is going to be a big part of it. See who gets invites. If Thomas Bryant gets a combine invite, I think that would probably speak volumes about sort of where the NBA is on him. And you're right. I talked to a number of NBA folks, scouting types, I think that there's, as you said, everyone knows Anunoby's going. He's declared he's signed with an agent. I think if I was reading the tea leaves, and I don't know that anybody just sort of flatly said this, but if I'm reading the tea leaves, I think that Bryant seems to be just a shade more toward staying in the draft in terms of kind of what, draft folks are in terms of how they're sort of reading the field. I get the sense that's what they're sensing, and I know that's a very vague way to put it, but, nobody just flat out came out and said, I just don't think he's coming back. I think everyone's still trying to kind of figure that stuff out. I did think it was noticeable, and I don't want to attach or assign too much, motive to this, but we didn't hear a ton about Thomas Bryant today. We heard a lot about Juwan Morgan. We heard a lot of sort of eagerness from Archie Miller about Durant Davis and his development over the course of the next few months, getting ready for next season. We didn't hear a lot about Tom. We even heard about James Blackman Jr. and Robert Johnson finishing up finals and then really kind of diving headfirst into the draft process, seeing what kind of feedback they can get and those sorts of things. Didn't hear a ton about Thomas Bryant. Now, I'm not guaranteeing that means he's out the door, he's gone, he's never coming back. That did kind of tickle the back of my mind, I guess, a little bit. I'm not really ready to say for sure, or even to offer a really firm sort of guess on Bryant, but I would say if I'm just kind of trying to analyze the field today, he's probably more, I would guess, I know I said I wasn't ready to make a firm guess, but as best I can right now, I think he might be a little bit more of a shade towards staying in the draft than those other two guys. But again, I think the combine, first the invites, and then after that the combine are going to be really big because, let's say Thomas Bryant doesn't get invited to the combine, and I'd be surprised if he didn't, but let's say he doesn't. Then that's a pretty big statement, pretty loud statement from the NBA on what it thinks he should do next. And so then maybe, guys' opinions change. There's always, January and February is the season for, we think this guy's gone and he's never coming back. March and April is the season for, well, he had some discreet conversations with some smart people and realized that maybe one more year in college would be good for him. Like I said, I think the combine is kind of the next big date that I'm sort of paying attention to see what that yields for the three guys that have left the door open to returning.
What else did Archie say today that kind of stuck out to you? I know that he talked for 20+ minutes, so there was a lot to get through. But what stood out to you besides the NBA talk, besides him talking about the recruiting classes and the importance of keeping that together? What stuck out?
He was very forthright in talking about recruiting and the fact that these two live periods, last weekend and this weekend, where coaches can watch players in AAU settings, they're very different for him and his staff right now because normally you're using these live periods to really kind of certainly evaluate some younger players, but also really zero in on guys that you've been recruiting for a period of time and try to sort of impress upon them your interest and try to really make sure that you've kind of dotted your I's and crossed your T's in terms of knowing that this guy is right for this reason, this guy fits in that way, so on and so forth. Right now, he said, that it's almost kind of from square one, and there's a lot. It's not necessarily a scattershot approach. I mean, they're obviously being, they're obviously planning out who they're going to see and why. But there is a very sort of, wide lens view, I guess you'd say, being taken at the moment in terms of just trying to see a lot of guys, evaluate a lot of guys, and really sort of restart because of the coaching change, Indiana's pursuit of a number of prospects. And I think the other thing he said that was interesting was, he talked, I asked about, specifically about scheduling, because he said in his introductory news conference, he said that non-conference scheduling in his mind was basically the way that you build and protect your NCAA tournament seeding. That at the end of the day in the Big Ten, you can't control what schedule you play, but you can also assume that you're going to get at least a few chances at real quality wins, whether at home or on the road. But the non-conference is where you can control how much good or bad you do for your NCAA tournament resume. He brought up the idea of home and homes with some marquee opponents. He brought up the Maui Invitational. He brought up the Battle for Atlantis, which I thought was interesting. I think it's clear that he wants to be aggressive about getting Indiana into – not that Indiana wasn't before, just to be clear. I mean, Indiana was in the Maui Invitational. Indiana played Kansas and Hawaii last year. They're going to play North Carolina and New York next season, or 2 seasons from now, 2018-19. But that he kind of wants to maintain that marquee, or maybe even enhance that sort of marquee scheduling at the top of the non-conference slate, and then, really find a way to make sure that he's getting the right kinds of teams, home and at home, teams that are going to help you, a nice balance of teams that, like, A, would help the RPI, but B, are also going to, and we heard Tom Crean talk so much about this too, are going to be able to give Indiana a good look at, we need to see a team that presses full court.
Oh yeah, just like Houston Baptist and Savannah State, just like those two pressing teams.
But you understand what
they learned a lot. They learned a lot from those games. When we talked earlier this year, when I was railing on the non-conference schedule, you would bring up the fact that they would schedule teams that play a different style. It's Savannah State's press isn't like Louisville's press. Okay, they're not one and the same.
No, there's no question about that. And
so it doesn't prepare you, and it didn't prepare them for Big Ten play.
That's what he's talking about when he's talking about getting the right numbers in the right places, is making sure that you're getting teams that will give you the look you need, but also a quality look as best you can.
Schedule a MAC team or a Missouri Valley team, not MEAC.
Not everybody's going to – I mean, not many people are going to be able to replicate Louisville's press, even if you – try to schedule a little bit better. So anyway,
glorified scrimmages.
Let's not devolve into
okay. I know I'm getting heated.
Scheduling discussion, but it's clear. He said a lot of this stuff again. Like it felt like, and this is another big part of what I wrote today. It felt like the news conference last month was a lot of the theory, sort of the sort of broader vision he had for Indiana. I felt like we got more of the reality, more of basically the practical execution of some of that theory, or the beginnings thereof anyway, today. And you just kind of feel like words are being put into action, and that it's happening in such a crystallized way so quickly is a suggestion, like I said, that Miller has found a real comfort level. And in terms of scheduling, I would not be surprised to see, home and home with Arizona type situation. I would not be. These are not necessarily. I'm not saying these things because somebody has told me, like, oh, hey, I can't tell you this on the record, but if you mentioned it, you wouldn't be wrong. This is just my estimation of what's in front of me right now. I wouldn't be stunned, frankly, if you told me that the IU Kentucky series would be back in 2 or 3 years in some form or another. And again, nobody said, hey, this is in the works. You better be ready for it. But I really think that that's kind of what he's looking for long term is maybe even just a little bit more heft at the top end of that non-conference schedule.
Okay, well, you also talked with all 3 assistants. Tom Ostrom, who came from Dayton with Archie Miller, Bruiser Flint, who's got a lot of experience as a head coach, sat out last season, and as we talked off the podcast, in the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote a story last year about Bruiser Flint's year away from coaching. He took a year off, and that he traveled with Larry Brown, the former Indiana Pacers coach, Kansas coach, and SMU coach, about and looking at other schools' practices. And he actually visited Indiana, watched IU's practice, and was quoted in the article saying it was the most impressive practice he's seen. So he's seen these players. So he has some familiarity with them, even despite the fact that he took a year off. And then, of course, there's Ed Schilling, the former Park Tudor coach who won 2 state titles while he was here before heading off to UCLA and being an assistant for Steve Alford. So this was your first chance to talk with all 3 of these guys. What stood out to you? First, we can talk about Tom Ostrom.
Well, it's Ostrom first.
Ostrom. Well, see, I got Osterman instead of Osterman. I was
you've
conditioned me
with the OST name.
Yeah, you conditioned me.
You always got to get them right. With all 3 of them, and in different ways, and this sounds vague, but none of the 3 seem particularly overwhelmed or out of place, or maybe sort of still a little bit uncomfortable. Again, a little bit like Archie Miller. uncomfortable themselves with stepping in at Indiana. And I think you see, we've heard a lot. I wrote some, others have written about kind of the strength of Archie Miller's bloodlines. And when people say bloodlines, I think we tend to think of, the person we're talking about as though they're not a part of that. I mean, Archie Miller's success makes him a part of this, sort of group. But you hear so much about like John Calipari, Sean Miller, Archie Miller, John Miller, Herb Sendek, just that cluster of talent that's come out of in coaching and in playing, frankly, with some of those guys from Western Pennsylvania and the Pittsburgh area. All three of these guys have strong ties to Archie Miller and Bruiser Flint's a guy that coached with John Calipari for a number of years, is still, I think, very, very close with him.
Yeah, was in the 30 for 30 quite a bit.
Ed Schilling coached with Calipari and was also Sean Miller's best man, and basically admitted today that Sean acted as the go-between for Archie in terms of calling Schilling up and saying, "Would you be interested in this?" and connecting the two of them. Tom Osterman, obviously. Well, you're the one who got me doing this. You're the one who screwed me up.
I'm just saying.
He was with Miller for so many years at Dayton, so you get the sense that there's also just kind of a strength in familiarity with the staff, I guess you'd say, to some degree. And, how it all shakes out, Ostrom was very particular to say today that it's not, basketball's not football, that responsibilities are never perfectly delineated. It's not like you've got a recruiting coordinator over here and a point guards coach over here and a power forwards coach over here. But you just get the sense that this is a group that's got a lot of familiarity with one another, a lot of familiarity with Archie Miller and sort of his way of doing things. And again, his vision, for lack of something a little bit less cliche. And so therefore, I think a staff that's very well positioned to just kind of hit the ground running, and probably to some extent already has.
Is it too late for IU and Romeo Langford?
Based on the number of reports of them, already having, I think, visited him as much as they can or wherever they can, gone down to New Albany.
Well, you have to try. You have to try. The optics are you have to be there. You have to show up at New Albany when you're allowed to, and you have to be have to be courtside when he plays. Yeah, you have to be there. But
nonetheless, particularly again in hearing Archie Miller talk today about just how much ground Indiana's got to cover in recruiting between rebuilding some relationships or beginning some relationships with guys that maybe had relationships with the old staff, but now don't feel like they're, know as Indiana or have the same comfort level with Indiana, in terms of being able to, evaluate players and figure out, okay, who fits what we're trying to do? What do we need? Who can fit where? Who can do what for us? That kind of thing. As much ground as Indiana looks like it's trying to cover right now in recruiting, to dedicate so much time and energy. You're right about the optics, but that doesn't change the fact that, you are still giving a lot of time over to one guy. If you didn't think you had a chance, I don't think you would be pushing as hard as Indiana is kind of early on here. And maybe they find out down the road somewhere here that it's not going to happen, and then they start to ease off. But for right now, they're clearly taking their chance as best they can with Romeo Langford.
Okay. Well, we could touch on a number of other subjects, but this podcast is already getting close to 25 minutes. And you know what? I don't know if I want to talk to you anymore.
You don't want to talk about Little Five last weekend?
No, we are not talking about Little Five, okay?
Why not?
Because
you're just mad. Are you mad Kappa Kappa Gamma didn't win the women's race?
My wife is mad that Kappa Kappa Gamma didn't win the women's race. I couldn't care less. As an undergrad, I went to Little Five once. And I didn't get the big hoopla. I didn't understand it. It's bicycles going in a circle. The best part is when people crash, and then you got people breaking clavicles and stuff, and that's fun for maybe 10 minutes. After that, you just feel sorry for these kids.
This may be our last podcast together. I'm not sure I can bring myself to.
It's a bike race. It's a bike race in circles. It's not even like a bike race through like the streets of some nice European city.
Hey now.
What?
Hey now.
What? Am I lying? Is it not a bike race in a circle?
it is more than a bike race in a circle.
Oh yeah, the handoffs are so exciting.
It's you know what? If you can't appreciate it.
Yeah, I wasn't in a house. And when I was there, it was a very Greek event. Now I know there's a lot of independent teams now. I guess I would say probably in the last 10 years, a lot of independent teams. But if you don't have a dog in the fight, you don't care. I don't care. And half the time the weather's crappy anyways. So, little five. I'm there for the parties, and even that, it's kind of annoying now. At the part, and I'm obviously too old to go back down and party.
I was going to say, is it annoying because you're just too old to party?
Yeah, no, I'm an old fuddy-duddy. Yeah, I can't handle it, and I don't know who Future is or Flo Rida, so I don't know any of this, the concerts that they have down there. I don't know if either of those guys were down there. Just saw a couple.
I was going to say, is Flo Rida even still popular?
He's going to be at the Reds Stadium and the Pirates Stadium. If you watch the Cubs games in the background, they got little advertisements for Flo Rida. So. That's
not a ringing endorsement.
I'm just saying he's going to be playing before baseball games, so that's the demographic too for baseball is the Flo Rida crowd. So yeah, no, Little Five never did it for me. Never was a big fan. My wife, she actually she wasn't a rider, but she was a practice rider. She's as a freshman she was part of Kappa's setup, but didn't actually get in the race.
Gotcha. Well,
I just know she was bruised all the time. She was bruised. That beats you up, that race. I mean, you got to be tough to do it. I get that. No, it
does.
I get it, but
I've still got cinder under my skin.
Yeah, no,
I've got little gray streaks on my knees.
I'd rather just enjoy my college career rather than have to wake up at the crack of dawn and bike 30 miles, just so I can. You just like the spandex. You just like the bike shorts, really.
You think it was only 30 miles?
No, see the 30 miles. You did more than 30 miles a day.
If I'm getting up at the crack of dawn, I'm riding at least 60.
Oh, see, that's, you know what? And while you were riding, I was still sleeping, nursing a hangover from the night before, because I was living. Okay, I was livin, living.
I nursed plenty of hangovers on the back roads of southern Indiana. Believe me.
Sweating it out.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this podcast has gone off the rails, and that'll happen when you talk about Little 500, because I don't care about it. I don't care one iota about it. So there you go.
Well, it doesn't care about you either.
I'm sure it doesn't. We'll shoot it for a photo gallery and we'll get it in the paper. But I don't care about it. It's a bike race. All right. Well, so that wraps it up here. I don't even want to close. Zach, say goodbye.
Goodbye.